Hello? Hello?
Podcast Network Asia.
Welcome to She Talks Peace, a podcast that highlights the role of women peacebuilders around the world in bringing lasting peace and security to communities. Eavesdrop on their communities and get to know their stories. From the Philippines to Malaysia, from Indonesia to Palestine, from Myanmar to the United States. Their dreams and hopes for a world without violence and a world where every woman and girl can be whoever she wants to be. Hosted by Amina Rasul Bernardo, President of the Philippine Center for Islam and Democracy. This is She Talks Peace.
Hello, salam everyone. Welcome to episode 57 of She Talks Peace. I'm Amina Rasul of the Philippine Center for Islam and Democracy, greeting you from Manila. You know, dear listeners, this week brought us the sad news that Queen Elizabeth II died. That was on September 8th at the age of 96. While the Philippines is not a part of the Commonwealth, still we shared the grief of Her Majesty's family and her constituents. She was a leader, probably the most known leader of the world, a woman who inspired and was steadfast in her commitment to peace and a world united. She was loved by her people. And I thought maybe I could share with you some of the quotes that were attributed to her that shows what kind of a leader she was. During the Second World War, I wasn't born yet then, and I suppose neither were most of you. They had this wartime broadcast to lift the morale of the British people. And in 1940, October 13, 1940, this may have been her first broadcast. And she said, "When peace comes, remember it will be for us, the children of today, to make the world of tomorrow a better and happier place." That's pretty amazing coming from a teenager to be thinking of the future and the role that she would play. And for the 70 plus years of her reign, she did try to make the world a better and happier place. And then she had a very inspiring quote during the pandemic. This was, I think, at 2020. And she said, "While we may have more still to endure, better days will return. We will be with our friends again. We will be with our families again. We will meet again." And I think that really helped her people to cope with the horrible pandemic that was COVID-19. Then I like this quote from her. She says, "It's worth remembering that it is often the small steps, not the giant leaps, that bring about the most lasting change." And then for all of us who have been struggling in our communities to reform the system, to try and make our communities better, she said, "It has always been easy to hate and destroy. To build and to cherish is much more difficult. When life seems hard, the courageous do not lie down and accept defeat. Instead, they are all the more determined to struggle for a better future." Today, there are so many clashing points of view, you know. I mean, all you have to do is look at the United States to see how polarized the communities have become, all because of lies that are told frequently, making them seem like fact. And Queen Elizabeth had a good statement about that. And she said, we may hold different points of view, but it is in times of stress and difficulty that we most need to remember that we have much more in common than there is dividing us. And she also said, the world is not the most pleasant place. Eventually, your parents leave you, and nobody is going to go out of their way to protect you unconditionally. You need to learn to stand up for yourself and what you believe, and sometimes, pardon my language, kick some ass. I think that was probably one of the very few quotes from her when she tells it like it is. And this one you're going to like. She says, I know of no single formula for success, but over the years, I have observed that some attributes of leadership are universal and are often about finding ways of encouraging people to combine their efforts, their talents, their insights, their enthusiasm, and their inspiration to work together. And with that last quote from her, I'm really excited to introduce to you our guest because she is a teacher, she's a professor, and she's one of those women who really spend time and energy to encourage her students, her constituents, to share their talents and insights, all for the common good. And our guest today is Dr. Lourdesita Sobrevega-Chan, the Philippines Women Rights Representative to the ASEAN Commission for the Promotion and Protection of Women and Children, or ACWC. Professor Chan, fondly called Professor Bing by her friends and admirers, has served as representative to the ACWC since 2017. She is also the chairperson of the Ateneo de Davao University's Research Council. And today, Professor Bing will be sharing with us her own personal journey as a women's rights advocate, as well as her experience in the ACWC, particularly the work that she's now doing, helping to draft the ASEAN's regional plan of action for women, peace, and security. Dear listeners, you have heard us talk about women, peace, and security issues over the past year, from women peace builders in conflict areas. Today, we shall hear from someone who is actually working on a plan of action that can help women in 10 countries of ASEAN. Welcome, Professor Bing Chan.
Thank you, Amina. Good afternoon, and thank you for that very warm introduction. And also, good afternoon to the listeners and the viewers of this podcast, as well as to our production staff. So, yes, I'm so happy to hear those words that you have quoted from Queen Elizabeth. If I may make a rejoinder into that.
Oh, yes, please, Prof. Bing.
Yeah, just few. Incidentally, in my lesson this morning, the topic is on Cicero, or in Latin, Cicero, that Roman statesperson, And one of the political insights that he mentioned is for leaders to have, the law that he says leaders and countries should have is inspired, is propelled by the love for humanity. And one of the manifestations of this love for humanity, which is a subscription to law, for leaders is to show loyalty and dedication to duty, loyalty to country and service. And incidentally, I cited the Queen for her exemplary service to her people and the realm during the Second World War, when she never left. She and her family did not leave the Buckingham Palace to hide at the Balmoral. She wants to be with her people at the time when bombers are coming into exchanges during that difficult time. So very rare. And I'm so happy that you cited her because she is a woman leader also. Thank you. Yes.
She was really amazing, Prof. Bing. Can you imagine? She actually served with the Women's Auxiliary Corps as a mechanic, and she
Exactly.
actually learned how to strip an engine and repair
Yeah.
an engine. That's pretty amazing. A royalty and a
Yeah.
woman learning to
Yes.
become a mechanic during the war.
Yes. Exactly.
I cannot imagine some of our women leaders all over the world doing that
Doing
kind of
that.
thing. But she was of her era, and she was pretty amazing. 70+ years
Yes. Yeah.
of governance,
Yes.
and I think, I mean, if she had been with us in ASEAN, I think she would be one of those that would be supporting the work that you're doing with the ACWC. But before we go into the Women, Peace and Security Plan, tell us, Prof. Bing, what does the ACWC do?
What is this organization? Is that what
Yes.
you mean, ma'am? Okay. Briefly, the ACWC, which we call as the ASEAN Commission for the Promotion and Protection of the Rights of Women and Children, is a human rights body of the ASEAN. As a human rights body of the ASEAN, it is dedicated in studying the specific, particular situation of women and children in the region and find ways and means to promote protection, to promote the rights, find ways and means to find measures by which those rights can be protected, can be respected, and can be promoted. And how does ACWC do this? Through the composition, which is a representation of the 10 member states. Each of the states has two representatives, one for children and one for women's rights. The member commission does a study on the specific issues that emerges that are considered to be of priority in the region. And from these studies, policy decisions, policy options are thereby recommended to the right bodies for adoption. Now, for the policy formulation work of the commission, often we find a way of coming up with joint statements, as in the case of the Women, Peace and Security. We have the joint statement. On something more about that, I can elaborate later. And then we have declarations to put a stop to violence against women, to put a stop to violence against children. Then there are various documents like to promote gender mainstreaming, to protect the rights of the migrant workers, and all that stuff. So it's a combination. As a commission, we sort of forward, the issues of women and children in order for member states to act on these issues based on the shared agreements that are forged along the way as we move with our work. The good thing about the work here is it's evidence based. It's always backed up by research, and it is done in consultation with the various relevant bodies in the ASEAN. Cross-pillar, inter-pillar consultations are done. If we note, there are three major pillars in the community pillars of the ASEAN: the sociocultural pillar, the ASEAN Economic Community pillar, and the peace and security pillar. So, like for example, for the WPS, while it started from the sociocultural pillar, community pillar, then we involved the ASEAN Economic Community and the Peace and Security Community pillar to be part of the work. So, yeah, it's an exciting work. The members are coming from either government, there are countries who send their government representatives, and there are countries who send representatives from the private sector or from the civil society organizations. So like myself, I come from the civil society organization. but appointments are done by the respective governments.
By the way, Prof. Bing, I just came from a consultation with the youth sector, an ASEAN-wide consultation. There were like 62 young youth representatives who joined us. And because maybe they're young and therefore they're, what do you call this, they want everything done fast. There's always this complaint that ASEAN moves so slow and that they don't see the impact. And I try to tell them, no. I mean, if you look at how ASEAN has evolved over the last 50 years, you can see where successes have been made in making the region more stable, more secure, and even so far as supporting human rights, especially women's rights. What has your experience been with ACWC, Prof. Bing? I mean, are you happy with the progress ASEAN has made in the field of protection of the rights of women and children?
Thank you for that question, Amina, and for sharing the insights of the young people about it. I have heard that several times, the comments that ASEAN is quite slow in the way it responds to things. No? Coming from within, I would say, am I happy about this? After so many years of being part of the commission, I think I feel privileged to be a part of this body where we can make a dent. No, we can influence policy directions and decisions of the key stakeholder in the region, and these are the 10 member states. Okay, let me qualify. What is so desirable about the process? For the issues that are of pressing concern, like violence against women and children.
Oh, that's important.
Yeah, these are not easy to deal with. Most especially that you have to deal with, the dominant notion of a masculinist state.
Mm-hmm.
And how do you mobilize a masculinist state to move its resources, policies, financial allocations, its people in support of programs and campaign to systematically put an end to violence against women and children? If not for this body, if not for the shared conversations. One of the principles by which ASEAN stands by its processes is it has to be inclusive. It should rely on consensus, and it should not leave anyone behind. So any issues like violence against women that has to be acted upon is addressed methodically. And we have to deal with 10 countries. And the 10 countries in the region are of different political systems, political orientations. And
you have a monarchy, you have a democracy.
Yeah, different economic statuses, But what is amazing there is when you start to discuss among the commission's representatives level, the differences may be evident, but along the way, it is managed. And yeah, you're right in saying earlier, it may start with differences, but eventually we realize we are one people. Even if we have different political systems, we care for our people. And so eventually we come up with an agreement, put a stop to the violence against children in the digital space, like online bullying. That's one of the latest we have agreed upon. So in the meetings, there are discussions. How can you call it violence? Because it's just in the online, in the digital space. So the way the issues are crystallized and we come to a consensus. And once we have done it, then we go through the process of consultation within the ranks until it reaches the table of the head of states. Having the head of states approve it and sign it is a major milestone. I'm a teacher of political science, Amina, and I recognize how the processes and how difficult it is to get
Yeah,
states.
being, I mean,
Yes.
just lobbying within our government alone
Yeah.
is such a long and difficult process. Imagine having to deal with 10 governments.
Yes. And then the papers are circulated, then you have to review and all that stuff, convince each other. And then once it reaches the agreement and they sign, then that's a victory. While it is a victory, this I think what should our young people and the rest should appreciate. The signing of agreements, of declarations at the head of state level is a major victory. And the gain that you have there is you have the political commitment of heads of state to do something about it. But the real battleground remains in the implementation in the member state. And that is
Absolutely.
where the dynamic force, the synergy of action of civil society organizations, government agencies, private sector becomes necessary in order to engage their governments to implement the agreement that they have signed.
I'm really glad you mentioned civil society, Prof. Bing, because many of the countries of ASEAN don't really have the robust civil society that we in the Philippines have. So let me ask you a personal question. How did you get into women's rights activism? You're a professor of political science, but now you're known as a women's rights advocate. So can you tell us what was your awakening moment that you got into advocacy for women's rights?
Yes, I started, I am a martial law baby in the Philippines. Okay. So I graduated in political science from the University of the Philippines that was under martial law. Remember that among the universities in the country, I think it was only UP who was able to carry out no, the political science program throughout the
Yeah.
period of martial law. So, but my understanding of the realities when I was in the academy, then as a student, is more of theoretical. But when I got started working as a professor, I started to understand the dynamics of the movement from the ground. So what was my awakening here? My awakening, it's profound. I think it's more in the line of third world feminism. When we try to understand why the poverty in the country, why the discrimination, why the the vulnerability and the human rights victimization, why the inability to participate and to withstand a very strong state, then we start to realize that even if it is both the men and women who are rallying for major and radical changes, there manifests a peculiar face to the problem where the relationship of men and women are concerned.
Uh-huh.
Yes, if you take stock of the gender diversity table of the leaders of the country, even at the time onwards, we notice that they are all largely men. You know?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I come from Mindanao, and Mindanao is a zone of conflict. You know that.
Oh,
The men
yes.
of those on the front line and the decision makers are men. And so I started to get engaged with colleagues who started to discuss about where are the women in all this. So it started from the national situation analysis, and then we crossed to the point that there is a phase in this problem, and that is the unequal gender power relations. And it's not just gender, it's really about women's marginalization, discrimination, and subordination, and all that stuff. So it started with that, Amina. And so there was no more turning back. Yes.
I'm so glad that there was no turning back, because now we have you in ACWC helping to make a draft regional plan of action on women, peace, and security, that hopefully can really help empower women at the community level, whether it's in Myanmar or in Mindanao, to participate. Because women's participation, every time you have a peace process, it's shown that agreements become more sustainable. So let's go into this regional plan of action, Prof. Bing. What can you say about that? What does the regional plan of action on women, peace, and security look like?
Okay, would you allow me to give a little background, and then
Sure,
I
yes,
will get into
please.
that? Yes. When I joined the ACWC in 2017, the first major responsibility assigned to me is to work for, if possible, a joint statement on women, peace, and security at the ACWC level. The reason why I was tasked, because in 2017, on the 50th anniversary of the ASEAN, I think it was the Philippines who was the chair of the ASEAN. And so I said, okay, I take this on, but let us try if we can push for the agreement of the head of states for this year. And the rest is history because we worked fast on it. And so the joint statement was not just at the commission level, but eventually we had it for the entire region, where the head of state signed in the summit in Manila. Now, the joint statement, fortunately, I cannot continue on saying without acknowledging the support of the previous president of the country, President Rodrigo Roa Duterte, because he was the ASEAN chair at the time. And I think he's being someone from Mindanao and has been a witness to the many conflicts that we have to navigate also our lifetime. Then I think he was just the right president to see the importance of this document. And so the Women, Peace, and Security document was signed, which really highlighted that we have to promote the culture of peace. That in the promotion of the culture of peace and the prevention, we should involve the women as well as the men and the boys to be part of it. So it is a concerted effort. But for the most part, it really asserts that women should be part of the peace building effort, no, for that. And then we have to have an inclusive movement for peace. And as we mobilize women's involvement, then we have to build their capacity as peace builders. Because remember, even if we have a good record of women involved in peace building, for the most part, the idea of a peace building work has always been one that is stereotypically masculine, right?
Because they think
And
of it
so,
as security, defense, therefore military.
yes, yes, when in fact it is not.
Yeah, it's not.
And the document recognizes women as mothers and as wives, that they are a key force for peace building. And so the rest was history. And from the WPS joint statement, the ministers of ASEAN had an ASEAN ministerial document that reinforces the women, peace, and secure the joint statement. And one of the strengths, while it asserts, no, for and it supported the message of the joint women, peace, and security statement, which, by the way, also highlighted the point that gender-related violence, such as sexual violations, rape, should be a no-no in the
Criminalized, right? It's
ASEAN. It should be-
criminalized.
Yes. So in the ASEAN ministerial meeting, I think the good one major contribution that it has is it already recognizes, it commits that all the member states should really involve women in all the
Mhm.
peace building efforts, and that the women should take more leadership position in politics, in governance, so that they can have an impact in the peace building effort. And they have to work for sustainable peace and stability in the region. Notice that by saying sustainable peace, it does not only mean the conflict thing, but it's really sustainable peace in all aspects. No? And the thing about this statement also is it is not just something that the sociocultural community, since the ACWC and the ASEAN Committee on Women is coming from this pillar, it's not just a matter of work for the sociocultural community pillar, but this time it says it has to be with the involvement of the ASEAN economic community as well as of the political and security pillar. So an integrated
That's right.
work of the three community pillars. And
So you're mainstreaming WPS into the
yes,
other pillars
yes,
and
ma'am. Yeah,
sectors.
that's very powerful and very important. And then this was also backed up by the regional study on women, peace, and security, which provides us the evidence as to where the countries are relative to this advocacy. And one of the recommendations of the regional peace study on WPS is to come up with the regional plan of action. Note that the regional plan of action is now veering towards concrete measures that will serve as guide for member states on what to do, no, to carry out the WPS in the respective state level. Although, as a side bit, I would like to mention that we are also in the Philippines planning to push for the declaration on WPS, but we are paving the way now for the moment for the passage of the regional plan of action, of which I am part of its advisory group.
So tell us what is in the regional plan of action, and do you really think it's going to push the envelope a little bit more for empowering women in peace and
Yeah.
security?
For all the efforts that were poured into it, I would like to believe so. Because the consultation, because we moved from one component to another in the consultation, I think it was also an educational process along the way, which will help member states do their work. What is in it? As I said, the regional study provided us the context of where we are in ASEAN on WPS. The RPA outlines the key strategies and actions to be taken. In each component, where they use this framework, the protection matrix. So, what are we going to do in the protection matrix? What are we going to do in the participation matrix? What are we going to do in the prevention matrix? In the relief and recovery matrix, that is the component of peace building, in the implementation, coordination, reporting, monitoring, evaluation matrix. I think our consultation, remember we had some consultations, Amina, in the
Yes,
country about
yes.
this. Many of the points that you and your team has given to me were carried over in the document of the proposed draft of the RPA. Now, what is so striking about about the content? I cannot enumerate all because it's so lengthy. What is very striking is the one you mentioned earlier on. While we recognize the state responsibility to push for peace building efforts, the RPA still recognizes that, but for the good part, it mentions or it asserts the community participation in promoting peace in the region.
Oh, that
And
is so important, Prof. Ding.
yes, ma'am.
Localize it. Yes.
Yeah, I think that's the right word. Localization of the peace building and security work is just one of them. So it's the peace building effort to be done locally with the cooperation of the various groups in the community, side by side or in partnership with government. So it's like a total approach involving the community, the government, even the faith-based organizations. Because we are in the region, ASEAN as a region, I mean, we are all aware that the factor of religion, the faith-based organizations have a key role in many of the discourses involving peace in the area. So faith-based organizations should be made part of this. Okay. And then also it pushes for more involvement of women in politics. So meaning we look at this as a strategic move also to pave the way for women to break through the ceiling, no, the boundaries
Yeah.
that women in the community, in the various levels of governance, if they want peace, they have to be a part of it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Professor Bing, generally, when we look at the pillars for
Yes.
women, peace, and security, protection, participation, prevention, recovery.
Really,
When you
yeah.
talk about protection, I think almost all of the governments accept that as as an obligation of the state. When you talk
Yes.
about prevention of conflict, they also agree. But when it comes to participation, I think
That
that's
is
where you
the
get
tricky
so
part.
much resistance. The only Indonesia and the Philippines have national action plans for women, peace, and security. And interestingly, those two countries also have, I think, more women who are in, leadership positions. So, how are you going to push the participation of women as a pillar, Prof. Bing?
Yes. Please take note, Amina, that we are also working side by side with the ASEAN Commission on Women. This is the ministerial body of women in the ASEAN, the government ministers on women in the ASEAN. And the ACW, with the support of ACWC, has likewise already successfully passed the gender mainstreaming framework, upon which all initiatives in the ASEAN has to be guided by.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so side by side, and that was signed already, I think, by the member states. With that commitment from the member states to mainstream gender in almost all spheres of governance operation, then we are hopeful that this can provide a steady and a promising support to the push in the RPA to increase women's participation in peace building work. Yes, because the gender mainstreaming to which the the states have committed requires allocation of resources, real resources, and
Oh,
therefore
I'm glad you
requires,
said real resources.
yes, and it requires audit, Amina. You have to audit, respective governments as to check where they are. If you allocate resources, where did it go and all that. If we have to refer to the Philippines, the Philippine Commission on Women, who is the ones responsible for auditing this, are checking where agencies are putting their God budgets and what have been done so far. So we look forward to that. But see, those are promising measures coming from the formal state. Okay, so much hope, and that we have learned along the way. You know that because you have been a very active woman leader on women, peace, and security. You know that the key really here is the movement from the ground. That
Oh,
is
yeah.
where
Yeah.
we need a dynamic force from the civil society organizations, people's organizations, women-led organizations, in order to catalyze, the movement to promote greater women's participation in politics, since there is so much space now afforded by the formal mechanisms of government. I
But
think
but
this,
for being, let me ask you about that space for civil society participation, because it seems like in some of the ASEAN member states, Myanmar, for instance, the feeling is civil society organizations are not allies. They are seen as threats, and I think it's also happening in some of the other states. So in all of our consultations with civil society, they kept stressing we are allies, we're your partners, government. So let us participate for peace and security. how are you going to, in a way, convince the other governments of ASEAN that civil society is a very good partner, not just for peace and security, but for humanitarian work, right? Disaster and all that. How are you going to do that?
Precisely, we are aware of that, ma'am. Uh, Precisely, we are pushing for regional agreements that will bring member states to agree on this. That's why in the RPA, for example, time and again in all the processes that we have done, we really cross-check if we have put the position on the civil society organization as a positive force, you know, because once it is there in the formal document, there is no way by which the member state can just turn their back away. Of course, we know that in the practical level of political operations, things may be different. But all the more, there is hope that things can be mitigated or rectified if in the formal document a commitment has been made and then you have a basis to check on accountabilities. You see, that is where one of the strengths of the ASEAN agreements lie, that you are able to create a space where you bring the 10 member states together to a shared commitment that is written, that they have signed, so that when the going gets rough, there is a document for us to refer in terms of checking accountabilities. You
You
know,
know, Prof. Ping,
yeah,
I'm really glad that you're sharing your optimism with our listeners, because I think uh, conflict has surfaced so much.
yeah,
It's no longer just because of ISIS or
yeah,
Al Qaeda or Abu Sayyaf or Jamaah Islamiyah. You now have conflicts emanating from faith, like Christian nationalism in the United States. And with these kinds of conflict, it's not, I mean, it's easy to see how it can enter countries like Malaysia, which doesn't really have armed conflict, and
yeah,
start, right,
yeah,
snowballing or becoming a firestorm that can erupt into conflict. But still, many of these governments, when they look at prevention of conflict, they're still doing it at the state level and not really bringing in the
the ground.
ideas of union or youth sector or the religious sector of civil society. But as you said, getting the governments to agree
Yeah,
on common ground, like a language that talks about securing the participation of civil society. That is a necessary step, because once we have that, then those of us with civil society working at community levels, we can always use that, right? I mean, you can say,
that's
look,
right.
ASEAN now has a
Yeah,
regional plan of action. Government, you have got to do
yes,
something about it because you agreed. That's
yes, ma'am.
that's that's the way it's going to go, right, Prof. Bing?
I completely agree. Uh, Before I have my personal thoughts in support of your statement, Amina. But before that, let just me just give you some examples of the initiatives of some member states. Of course, you are right. It's the Philippines that started, that had the national plan of action ahead of the
Mm-hmm.
others, and this was followed by Indonesia.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so both of us have already two generation of NAP.
Right.
And the Philippines, the striking feature of the Philippines, its contribution is the localization of WPS agenda, particularly in the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region
Mm-hmm.
of Muslim Mindanao. Okay, through the development and implementation of the BARM Regional Plan of Action on WPS. That's on the local level. What Indonesia also showcased as a peculiar contribution is that it mainstreams WPS at the national level through the National plan of action on the
Mhm.
protection and empowerment of women and children in social conflicts.
Mhm.
Okay, so that's another model, no, that we have done.
So when you
And
talk about social conflict, that would now include issues of gender, LGBTQ, and all of those other very
touching
touchy issues. Yes.
issues. And then the second generation NAP of Indonesia focuses on preventing and countering violent extremism
Mhm.
that leads to terrorism. That issue is not strange to us in
Yes.
Mindanao in
Yes.
particular. No? So that's it. Now, if we go to Thailand, Thailand did not pass a national action plan, but what they have passed are measures and guidelines on women and the promotion of peace and security.
Mhm.
That is what they have. Quite tantamount to a NAP. In Cambodia, they have a gender action plan for law enforcement.
Mhm.
In Myanmar, they have a national strategic plan for advancement of women. Okay? And for Vietnam, they have a law on gender equality. Thus
Mhm.
far, these are the countries with very specific commitments to the call for national plan of action. Now, going back to, can you please refresh me a bit dun sa comment, in your earlier comment na, what is it, the one that you asked me to say something,
Oh,
Amina? Yeah, the
about
last,
how governments um, it's essentially about political participation of women and how you're going to convince this
other government.
government yeah to really support that particular pillar of the regional plan of action.
Yeah. Um, I have been in the women work for 4 decades, you know, 4 decades. And in all this time, there are really a lot of hurdles. Nothing is made easy. And always we always we are confronted with a formidable state, you know. I am
Mm-hmm.
speaking about this from the stand, even if I am part of the government as the
Yes, yes,
representative,
yes.
but my experience is from outside of government, where you have to deal with a formidable state. But one insight I have drawn all the years, even if you are faced with a formidable state, nothing is such formidable that you cannot penetrate it. And that is why, on the question, how are you going to mobilize and let this government realize that the CSOs, that the women groups matter? To me, the women groups must continue and persistently strengthen their ranks and unfailingly promote and assert for the principles and the issues that they advocate for.
We have to
So,
organize, organize,
yes,
organize.
organize, 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 and make our voices heard. There is no government, no matter how, I'm sorry to use the word, how formidable they may be, as
Mm,
we would see it, who cannot afford to listen.
that's true.
Because any government, Amina, is sensitive to public opinion.
That is true.
Any government is sensitive to public opinion. I'm sorry to say this. That is where that channel is where the women groups, the CSOs and the POs could always find their strength to let their voices be heard by government. And they must be ready with alternatives. Meaning you just do not integrate, you just do not engage, you just do not subvert.
Also, don't just criticize, offer something productive.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, do not just criticize. Offer something that is reliable and that is worthy for that government to consider as a possible option. I think it works, ma'am. It works. You would know that. Yes.
Yeah,
That's
you and I have been both in government and civil
yeah,
society, so we know that
I know.
to be true.
And
I know,
to share,
Prof. Bing,
yes,
so
ma'am.
much work needs to be done, so
I
much
tell
we
you,
need to talk about, but
yeah,
time is running out, and we're
yes,
almost at the end
right.
of our
Yes,
time. So before we go, Prof. Bing, I know that many of our listeners are young women. You'd be surprised to know that about 8% of our listeners are
are
teenagers, would you believe?
really wow.
So I'm sure that they would love advice from you, especially those who are aspiring to become empowered women or women's rights advocates. What would be your advice to them and also to the boys and men who support such women?
Yeah. Okay. So for the young girls who are present, the future is for you to build now. I mean, I've been dealing with the youth because I'm a professor. That is what I tell my students, and even for the boys, for the young men, the future is for you to build now. What future you would like to have, you build it now. And also, I tell them, if you treasure the liberty that you enjoy now, if you treasure the gains of freedom that you enjoy now, remember it was paid with the lives and bloods of those who came ahead of you. Then you should also fearlessly light a candle at any instance when dark clouds hover, you know? So, how would a young woman, a young man understand and commit to this? I say, study. Study and be sensitive to the situation where you are in. It all starts in the family. Look at your family. How are the gender relations in the family? Okay, I'm not saying you fight each other in the family, but study. Use it as a venue for you to study, and then you will see that there are privileges, there are discriminations and subordinations that are going on, and sadly, also in our families, there are those who suffer from violence. Then you ask yourself, should I just be a witness, a silent witness? Remember, violence may not victimize you now, but by the fact that you have witnessed it, slowly it will creep into your life. So if you do not want that to happen, then do something. Then a young girl would say, what can I do? It depends on the situation where you are in. My advice is be open. Remember, your survival, the promotion and protection of your individual rights rests on whether the collective rights of your people are also protected. Your protection of your right as a woman, as promotion of your right as a woman, is dependent on whether the collective rights of women and children are also protected. And this goes for the young men, the young boys that we have. Because remember, while it is true that there are sexual differences in the manifestation and attacks of violence, the digital technology, which is our ally in all account, has also democratized, broadened the space by which violence is able to infect us. So we cannot stay now. I mean, that's why I tell but the boys, no, among my students, you can no longer say it's only the women who will be affected. I tell you, Amina, there were students of ours who say before, oh, no, it's only the girls. You know, the first batch of students who came home to the university and say, we are truly happy that you protect. It's the men because they were not
Mhm.
ready to be violated. Something like that. You cannot be ready, but then it is for everybody to prepare. So study. If you are afraid, you study. Then if you see something wrong, speak out. It all
Yeah.
starts from there. never turn to a problem, never turn to a violent scenario with a closed eye and a silent mouth, because the next victim might be you. Something like that.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
Thanks so much, Professor Bing. Those are important words to remind our listeners, especially our young people, about how important it is that they participate, that they use their voice, and going back to Queen Elizabeth, the late Queen Elizabeth II, that a small step first.
Yeah.
Small steps matter. You don't necessarily have to go into giant leaps first.
Yes, that's right.
But if there is something that you can do in your immediate family, or you witness bullying among your friends, a small step, maybe a reminder that, hey, let's not do this, because do you want it done to you as well? So thank you so much, Prof. Bing, for your message for our listeners. And I do hope, dear listeners, that having listened to Professor Lourdesita Chan, our Professor Bing, that many of you would be inspired to join us in our advocacy for a better world, following what the late Queen Elizabeth II had dreamed for us, a better world where the children of today will be secure tomorrow, and will be those who are participating to create an even better world for everyone. So, dear listeners, in closing, before I say goodbye to you all, if you would like your questions, comments, or thoughts featured in future episodes of She Talks Peace, do send us an email at shetalkspeacepodcast@gmail.com. Let me repeat that. shetalkspeacepodcast@gmail.com. And with that, thank you so much, Professor Bing, for joining us. And would you like to say goodbye to our listeners wherever they are?
Amina, it's my great honor and pleasure to be invited in this podcast. Thank you for the privilege. And thank you to our dear listeners for your kind attention. And we hope that we find in you some of our successor generation who will carry on the task of promoting peace, not only for our immediate environment, but for the rest of the world. Thank you to our production crew. Thank you, Amina, and to all who spent their afternoon with us.
Thanks, Prof. Bing. And thank you all for listening to us. This is Amina Rasul saying goodbye. See you next time at She Talks Peace. Bye now.
Bye-bye.
She Talks Peace is brought to you in partnership with Podcast Network Asia and Podmetrics, the easiest way to monetize your podcast. For more information, check out their website at podcastnetwork.asia and podmetrics.co.
The views and opinions expressed by the podcast creators, hosts, and guests do not necessarily reflect the official policy and position of Podcast Network Asia, the hosts of the program, or other programs of the network. Any content provided by the people on the podcast are of their own opinion and are not intended to malign any religion, ethnic group, club, organization, company, individual, or anyone or anything.